Thank you, JB. So today's session, part 2 of our 5-day AMPScript bootcamp, we're going to be going over utility and data extension functions. And like JB said, these sessions are all about, getting a good overview of best practices. So definitely review the first session that JB did. Was excellent. We want to give you some ideas on how to get started. Give you some examples of basic to advanced personalization, all throughout using real use cases. And then eventually in our second half of our sessions to give you the opportunity to actually build with instructors themselves. So the first 5 sessions are going to be going through all those functions and use cases. And then the second session, let's build, we're going to be building out those functions in real time. So this is our overview of the presenters that are covering this bootcamp. So JB kicked us off last week. Today, my name is Tim Zeider, so I'm with Cervelo. We are a Salesforce partner. And full disclosure, I am not a developer. I'm more of a functional role. So I've invited Sandesh, who's a developer on the Marketing Cloud side, to keep me straight on some of the coding best practices. So Sandesh, if you're on the line, if you want to introduce yourself, give a quick overview of your experience.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sandesh. I'm consultant at Cervelo, colleague of Tim. I've been working with Marketing Cloud mostly in a developer capacity. So I'll just be here in the background answering some questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandesh. We've got Sabui coming up in a couple of weeks, who created the AMPScript 30, which JB overview. Definitely recommend checking that out and signing up for that. And then Cameron Robert coming up a little bit later down the road. You've probably all seen some of his YouTube videos. They're just fantastic on walkthroughs. So today's section, we're going to be going through those utility and data extension functions, in particular going to a deeper dive into lookup rows, lookup ordered rows, and for loops. So we'll dive into that, and then you can sort of see the upcoming sessions with Sabui and Cameron coming up. And Sandesh will be kicking off a session next week as well. And here's just a rough framework for some upcoming build sessions after we do our first 5 sessions on those functions. Again, these are still forming, but should give you an idea of the different use cases we're going to be doing in those sessions. All right, so let's get off with utility functions. So we're going to start with the core functions that we're going to go through today, which is attribute value, v, and empty. And then we'll be covering lightly the is, output, and then some other functions after those core functions themselves. So let's talk first of all with these 3 core functions that use most often, those utility functions. So let's start with attribute value. So it's a pretty basic function. What it does, it basically level sets all of your data when you're setting it to values. It avoids errors in the code. It basically converts the different values that could be present in those variables, especially around those empty, null, and even so those single quote values, and converts them all to empty. And that allows you to compare your variables effectively in your code. So we'll be walking through an example of that, multiple examples in the demo. The v function is a very straightforward function, but very highly used. Just outputs those variables in line. Can also be very helpful when you're QCing your code to make sure that you're outputting the variables as they're tracking through your logic. And then the last example we're going to be using is the empty function, which you can also use not empty. This is the first sort of step in the evaluation of those variables, so you can use in if statements to do conditional formatting of your coding to render different variables depending on the different scenarios within your use cases. So let's jump into Marketing Cloud. We're going to go over our first use case featuring these 3 functions. So in our example, we're going to be working for Northern Trail Outfitters, our favorite outdoor outfitter from Salesforce. And in this scenario, we're going to be welcoming these new loyalty members who just signed up for Northern Trail Outfitters. So we've got an email here that's got the welcome. We don't really have any personalization. That's what we're going to be building out through here, but we want to welcome them. And we want to give them a bunch of steps that they can do to help improve their loyalty experience. So to give you a brief overview of this setup, we've got a we've got this built in an email design system. So it's built on this template that's got 3 sections. We've got a header section, we've got a body section, and then we've got a footer section. This allows us to drag and drop different blocks into our code. Just makes it easier when you're creating emails. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to add some personalization. Instead of just rendering dear friend, we want to render the name, if possible, of that new loyalty member. Luckily, we've got this send date extension that goes along with this email send itself. And in the date extension, we've got a field that will be populated with the name of that subscriber. So we're going to want to leverage this data in the email send itself. So to leverage that data, what we're going to do is we want to create a section within this email to do a lot of our AMPScript work. So it's always recommended to use a code snippet block to house as much of your AMPScript data as possible, AMPScript coding in the email itself. So we're just going to drag this code snippet over here, and this is going to be where we're going to be doing a lot of our AMPScript coding. So we're just going to open up a AMPScript block, which is going to be a %, and then a square bracket, and then we're going to close it out as well. And this gives us a little bit of a canvas to do some of our AMPScript work. You can see over here that it appears, the AMPScript coding appears, and to remove that, just to make it look a little bit cleaner, you can use this arrow function to remove that code. So I'm just going to title this header code, and that will remove that AMPScript in the email itself, just sort of gives it some formatting and cleans up the email itself there. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to output this name variable in the greeting of the email itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a variable, let's call it greeting. And here's where we want to set it to the attribute value of that field in the data extension that we have attached to this send. So we're going to go to that field, we're going to copy the syntax for that field, and we're going to up here, we're going to end the quotes, and that's it. Just for good coding practices, we're going to want to declare this variable up above. So let me just copy that. And there we go. All right, so there's the first example using attribute value. So if that value is not populated, it'll just create it as empty, which we can use in later on. So now to render this greeting variable, what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this variable, and we're going to go outside of our AMPScript block, and now we're going to go inline into this greeting section, and all we're going to do here is we're going to replace friend, and we're going to use the v function to output this variable there. And again, we're using that v function that we just talked about, just outputting that variable. So let's do a preview and see how this renders. This is hooked up to the data extension itself. And let me just check my code. I might not have put in the right code in here. Yep, I added one too many equal signs. That was what that error was for. Let's go back and preview and test that again. And there we go. There's Kristen that's appearing. So we can see her in this name field that's coming through as Kristen. So there we go. There we're seeing that personalization come through. When we cycle through this data extension, as you might have caught, there are some records that don't actually have a name populated. It might just be a limitation of the data set. So what we want to do is we want to fix this so we can render at least a default value when nothing is present. So let's go back into our AMPScript block, and let's add in that logic.
Quick interruption, Tim. I think it's breaking up in between. If you don't mind taking off your video.
Oh, sure.
It may reduce the bandwidth, maybe. Just hoping.
Is that a little better?
It seems so. Yeah.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks for calling that out. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to do an if statement that says if that value that we're looking to render in the personalization is empty, then let's set it to a default value. So we're going to do a basic if statement. We're going to use that empty function, and we're going to check if this field is empty. And then we're going to set this variable to, we're going to hard code this variable for now to a certain let's call it new member. And then we always need to end an if statement with an end if. So there we go. Let's see what changes now in our personalization if we will solve that use case where if somebody is does not have a name, then we'll render there we go. There's that new member. So when a value is present for the name, we'll render that name. If that variable does not include anything, we've got at least a default value there. So there's a quick overview of how to use those three basic functions. Again, all captured within this code snippet to separate out your AMPScript coding away from inline in your email itself. So again, we use the attribute value, we use the v function, and then now we use this empty function as well. One thing before we move back into the deck is what you can do now, since you're variabilizing your content within the email itself, you can create content blocks that you can use. So whenever you need to create an email that needs a greeting, you can just save this block into your, what we've got is we've got a an email design system folder that allows you to save different modules in here. So we're just going to save this block, say we'll call it our greeting test block. Excuse me. And whenever you need a greeting block, you can literally just drag and drop that block into the email content itself. And whenever you need to change those variables that come through, say you're using a date extension that doesn't use the value of name, you can always just change it here in your AMPScript coding in your header code section. Okay, let's go back into, we're going to cover the rest of the functions within the utility section. Excuse me. Now these functions tend to be a little bit less used, a little bit more on the fringe, but worth mentioning. So this other function called is email address is phone number will return a true or false value if the variable that you're setting is either an email address or a phone. So in this use case, we're rendering a phone number for a sales rep from a lead if that phone number is actually a valid phone number. So we're using that if statement. If that variable is a phone number, then we're going to set this variable, the CTA variable, to yes, and that'll trigger in the email content itself to populate that CTA button with the phone number. You can also use that for the mail to function and for telephone number to render that phone number to be able to be called or emailed in the email content itself. Another function within the utility is the output line. So we tend to use v function here, but you can certainly use output as well and be handy. There are a couple other fringe type functions within utility domain. Can return the domain of the email address. We'll typically use the sent data view in queries after the email send for that. So definitely take a look at the sent data view information that's available. The get JWT would be used more for encryption. And then the IAF is a cool little function that will return a value if it is true, an alternate value if it's false. It's a great function, but if you're just starting out in personalizing with AMPScript, definitely recommend looking to do this a little bit later, as it can be confusing between a regular if and an IIF. So definitely think about that as you're looking to stand up those utility functions. Okay, the next section we're going to be diving into our data extension functions. Before I do that, I just want to see if there are any questions about those utility functions that we just walked through?
Thanks for the overview, Tim. So these are the utility functions that are basic and much required. So I don't see any questions as of now, but I have some notes for everyone who is attending the session. This session is for everyone who is starting afresh with the AMPScript or who is just learning Marketing Cloud. So if you're new to using Email Studio and you have trouble understanding any of the things that we discussed here, we'll be more than happy to demo them again, because we all understand that each of you attending are at different levels of learning. So if you're just starting and you're trying to find out where a certain option is or how to code something or miss something, just let us know. And Tim, I see some questions here. What's the difference between if and IIF, if and only if?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So an if is a statement. It's not a function. So as you saw in the example here, we're using it to compare to use it. It would use a function to ask a question. The IIF is a little bit different in that it's going to return a value if the first parameter is true, and this would be this full name. And if it's the second parameter, if it's false, it's going to return a second parameter. There's no need for a end if with an IIF. It's its own function. So it's kind of confusing. So we wanted to bring it up, but like I said, I would recommend focusing on building up your strength on your if statements. And then if you need to, you could use the IIF to help simplify those. It basically condenses a if statement into one line. So instead of it saying if not empty, then full name, else if true, then render as guessed. So it's a way to consolidate it, but it might cause some more confusion within your developer group if you're using ifs and IIFs within each other. Okay, so we'll jump into the next, which are the data extension functions. So we're going to be going into an in-depth look into lookup rows, the different variations with that. And then on the data extension side, looking at how you can insert, update, delete different data in data extensions. And then if we have a few minutes later, we can cover claim and execute filter. So taking a look at lookups, this is a commonly used function within the data extension functions. You're looking this up to use another data source to provide different values. So the first example of this is lookup. If you're looking to return a specific value from another data extension, you can use lookup. And so here's the syntax. There's 4 different fields that you want to use for this example. So lookup will be, first of all, you're looking into where the first field is the data extension where you're doing the lookup. The second field is the value you're looking to return to set your value to. And the third value is the lookup column in that data extension that is going to correspond to that unique key that you're providing. And then the fourth field is the unique key itself. So again, it returns a specific value, which you can set to a variable in that use case. We'll go over this example live in the demo in a second. Lookup rows gives you an opportunity to do 2 things. One, you can return multiple variables within a certain row within a data extension. And then with using for loops, you can return multiple rows worth of data. The actual syntax is a little bit simpler than lookup in that you just need to determine the data extension you're looking to, and then that unique value that you're looking to sort based on the value that you're providing. And then there's a variation on that, which is lookup ordered rows, which allows the ability to return a set of data in a particular order, whether that's ascending or descending. Again, we'll go through this in the demo in a second. There are some common functions that go along with these lookups that we'll be using as well. So when you're creating a for loop, you'll be using all of these. So row will give you a specific row as you're looking to render multiple rows within your solution. The row function returns a specific row. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. A row count will give you the count of the rows that's returned from the lookup rows function. The field will help you identify those fields within those rows that you want to output to use for your personalization. And then concat gives you a way to combine variables and also text into a variable that you can output if you're looking to output multiple rows. So we'll go through that in the demo as well. So let's go back into our email. And what we want to do is to improve upon this experience on this greeting as well. So again, we've got this set to this default value, but luckily we've got another data extension source that we can look to provide whenever that name isn't populated. We can look to this data extension and see if we can render the full name. So what we want to do is we want to, based on the subscriber key that is going to be sent this email, if their name isn't populated, we want to go look into this data extension for that same subscriber, and then we want to output their full name. So this will be a much better experience than new member. So to do that, we're going to go into the AMPScript guide, this handy guide that JB had mentioned in the first series, which give you all different types of syntax based on what you're looking to utilize for your solutions. So we're going to look up. And again, this gives you a breakdown of those fields that are required. Like that first field is the data extension. The second field is the column which you want to return that value. That third field is that identifier, that unique key that's going to identify which row that you want to select. And then this is the actual unique key itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down into this. We're just going to steal this syntax. We're going to bring it over and modify it in our code itself just to save some time. So we're going to go into this AMPScript block, and we're just going to paste it right over here where we had hard-coded this. And then we're going to set the greeting now. It's going to look up to this data extension. So the first thing I want to do is we want to set the appropriate data extension value here. So we're going to go back into this data extension. We're going to copy the name of it, and we're going to paste it here within these quotes. So we're going to select the right data extension. Okay. Now we want to find out the field that we want to return when we do this lookup. So again, that's that full name field is what we want to return when we do this lookup. So we're just going to go down here. We're going to copy this syntax just to make sure we get it correctly. And then we're going to paste it into this second section here, which is going to return that full name. Now we need to determine in this data extension, what's that key that's going to identify that subscriber that has that corresponding information. So it looks like in the data, we've got this field called subscriber key. So let's copy that subscriber key field. That's what we're going to want to sort off of. Again, that's that third field there. And then last but not least, we need to do a lookup value based on the email send for that's going to be a corresponding to that subscriber key. So we're going to go back to our data extension, which is our email send data extension. And we need to find the field in this data extension that corresponds to that subscriber key. So here's that same field that's based on subscriber key. So it's the same syntax. So we have to actually now set this variable because it's another field in our data extension. So what we're going to do is we're going to set, let's call this sub ID, and then we're going to set this to the attribute value of that subscriber key field that's in that data extension. Okay, and so now that we've got this variable, we're just going to copy this down into the fourth field in our lookup to complete that function. So now we're looking into this data extension. We want to return the full name when based on the subscriber key for this email send itself. So now we can hit done. We can go back and we can preview. Let's see if we have a change here. Okay, so we've got an error here, set attribute value. I must have added a space in here, so that's good. That's a great thing about Marketing Cloud. It gives you some very helpful errors. So subtype, so I've got attribute. There's a fat fingered that there. So let's see, that hopefully fixed that error. And let's preview there now. Okay, so here's an example where we've got that name field is not populated. So instead of just outputting new member, it's looking up into that data extensions, returning that full name, and here it outputs Chris Norrie. We go back to where that field is available in the original data extension, it outputs that. we'll go back to another example. Here's Patty Carlson that gets output. So there's a quick and easy way to use lookup to output that data within the data extension to improve our personalization. And again, we did not have to change this block at all. All we're doing is changing the header script here in our header code within the block itself. Okay, so the next scenario, we want to personalize this section. So we're seeing in this section, this is where we're saying that there's some steps that the user can take to help get the most out of their loyalty program. And it's kind of not really personalized here. It just says with a few easy steps. Well, it'd be great if we could, output the actual steps that they need to take to enhance their experience as a loyalty member. So luckily, we've got another data extension that was created by IT group, and it's got a listing of all these steps that we want to render in the email itself. So it's a complete list of all the steps based on those new members, and it's based it's just a full listing by their subscriber key. It lists the step that they would want to take to improve their loyalty program, and then there's also this bonus month that if they complete it by a specific month, they'll get some extra bonus points in their loyalty program. So what we want to do is we want to look up to this data extension based on that subscriber key. And we want to output in the email all of those steps that correspond to that subscriber key. And we want to output not just the step field, but we want to output this bonus month as well. So multiple row scenario where this subscriber exists in multiple different rows within the data extension. And then there are also multiple fields that we want to output as well. So for this scenario, we want to use the function lookup rows. So again, we're going to go back into marketing, the AMPScript guide, and here's an overview of that function, those first three fields, which we reviewed before. And we're going to go right into the code, and we're going to just steal a bunch of this code from the AMPScript guide, and we're going to modify it for our use case, again, just to save some time. So we're going to go into our code snippet, and we're going to add a new section down here, and let's just paste in that code. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the rows for this lookup rows function. So let's just change this to steps rows, just so that that is individual for this use case. And now let's fill out the rest of this lookup rows function. So the first field we want to enter here is the date extension that we're doing the lookup itself. So just like with the lookup scenario, we're going to go in here, we're going to copy the date extension, we're going to paste it into this first field that identifies sorry, that just pasted in the entire thing. I did not copy this. Let me copy that again. And we're just going to paste it into here, this first value. This is the data extension that we're looking at. And then the next data field that we want to populate is that unique field in this data extension that identifies who we're looking this up for. So what's that subscriber key? So in this data extension, it's actually called customer. So we're going to copy this customer field. We're going to go back into our code. And that's going to be our second field, is that customer. Now we've already created the sub ID value, so we can just paste that in here. And again, that completes that functionality. It's going to create a row set based on each subscriber key and return the number of rows, or the row set of those rows based on that lookup. So the next value that we're going to want to populate is this row count, which is going to output the actual count of the rows that are returned based on this lookup on line 13. So we're going to copy this down here into this row count function. So this will give us a number of like 1, 2, or 3. It's some sort of a count that the actual code can use, where this step rows count is a row set that's not really usable within the logic itself. So now that that's set, we're going to delete this output. We're going to output a little differently. And we've got our if statement. So what we want to do is we want to continue this process if that row count is greater than 0. If it's not, we're just going to have them skip through the look through altogether. So that we're going to create that if statement. We'll keep that there. The next part is our actual for loop. So let me just capitalize this so we can identify it a little bit better. So what this for loop is going to do, it's going to cycle through each time this I variable gets created. It's going to start from 1 all the way to the row count. So it's going to cycle through a certain set of steps as many times as there is a number in the row count. So to identify where this for loop begins and ends, we're just going to clean up this code a little bit. And it starts here at this for loop, and it ends at this next statement. So anything in between these two statements is what it's going to be run through this for loop. So let's just clean up this code a little bit. I'm going to remove this var statement. And so within the for loop itself, we have two different areas of functionality. The first thing what it's going to want to do, it's going to want to set the specific row as it's looking through each time it goes through each loop. So it's going to set this rows based on this step rows variable that's set on line 13. So it knows which row it's working with. So it's going to say, I want this row to be the row set that was set on line 13 based on this counter that keeps being counted within the for loop. Once you've identified that row, you can go within each of those records and output those variables one at a time. So the first variable that we're going to want to output is the step itself. So we're going to go into the data extension. We're going to find that field that we want to set to that step variable, and we're going to add that here for that field. That's where we're using this field functionality to output the field in the data extension and set it to this variable. The second variable that we want to set is this bonus month. And again, we're going to want to go to that data extension, and we're going to want to copy that syntax as well. We'll paste that in here. So that's going to return the second variable, which is bonus month. So one little best practice here is we're going to want to bring these two variables within our var statement. And just to make sure that they don't copy between each one of these loops, we want to reset them each time. Okay, there you go. Those are the two variables that we want to output. Now, the last part within our for loop, what we want to do is we want to set a variable that is going to output this, all of these different steps and rows. So let's call this step output. And we're going to set this to the concat function. So what this concat function gives us the ability to do is to just continually add to a variable all these different variables and all the different rows of data. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the concat. We're going to open up this paren and we're going to start setting some variables. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to set the concat. The first variable you want to set is the variable of the actual concat that you're looking to set. This will pick up previous rows worth of data. So then from this point on, you can set the individual rows that you want to output. So for each row in the output, I want to output the step. And then I want to add a little bit of text around that that says bonus month, colon, we're going to add a space. And then we're going to output the bonus month. Here. And then last but not least, we want to add in the ability to hit a return so that each row will appear on its own line. So a little bit of formatting built into this variable. And that should be it for that for loop. Let me just end if this if statement correctly. And now that we've got this variable set, all we're going to want to do is copy this variable and we're going to output in the HTML itself. So we're going to go in here. Let's just do a little bit of HTML. We're going to create a new line. We're going to call this steps. Let's create a new line. And then we're just going to output this new variable that we just created, a concat of a variety of different variables. So there's that. And again, I did 2 equals. Okay, so there might be an error or two in here, but let's just give this a whirl and see what happens. Again, we should see a variety of different steps that are different for each subscriber. So let's click a preview and test and see what gets outputted here. Okay, good. Oh, no errors. So here's what we got here. So based on, let's find a name that we know. So Kristen, she's got 4 different steps. She's got add warranty coverage for the month of October, refer a friend bonus, refer a friend, bonus month in June. So it's kind of a little bit hard to read here. Let's just go back into this formatting. Let's see if we can bold at least the step line to make this come out a little bit nicer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some HTML in here. So we're going to add a bold syntax. And then let's, at the end of this, it's right before the bonus month, we're going to close out that bold tag. That should do that there. Let's just see what happens if we preview that and see if that sort of improves the formatting slightly. There we go. So it sort of breaks out the step and the bonus month a little bit better there. So in a future session, in our second series of sessions, we're going to be building this out in a lot more detail. We're going to actually create a custom table. But I just wanted to give you an example of how you can use lookup rows to render multiple variables, multiple rows worth of data, and then also using that concat function give you the ability to combine variables and text into a line to help enhance that personalization. So one more step before we move off of this lookup functionality. As you can see, this isn't really ordered in the best way. You can see October, June, July, September. Kind of be nice if we had this in an order for our new loyalty members so that they knew which ones they should be focusing on first so they could get the most bonus points. So to do that, we're going to use a function called lookup ordered rows. So let's go back into our content. We're just going to use a slight variation of that function. Let's again go back into the AMPScript guide, and we're going to go to the lookup ordered rows variation. So the only difference between lookup rows and lookup ordered rows are these 2 fields right here. The first field outputs the number of rows that you want to output. So in our example, we want to output all of them. And then the second field is really the third field within the statement, is the identified column within your data extension that will help identify how these should be ordered. So again, we're going to go back into our code example here from the AMPScript guide, and we're going to copy this. We're going to bring this right over into our content, and we're going to make some changes on the fly here. Okay, so first thing we want to do is we want to copy the lookup ordered rows syntax down into replace the lookup rows. And then they're doing kind of a cool thing. They're setting a variable to this 0 value. So we're just going to literally just copy this. This is going to be our second field in this function statement. And there we go. That's going to set that 0 field. And then the last field we need to determine is the field in the data extension itself that will help with the ranking of the order. So in this data extension, we've got this date field, which will be a good candidate for that. So we're going to copy this date field over here. We're going to go back into the lookup order rows section, and this is down here. We're going to do a double quote. We're going to put in that date. And here's where you type in that ascending or descending. So we want to use ascending for this use case because we want the earliest month to appear first. And there it goes. That's how you can modify your lookup rows to lookup order rows, as simple as that. Hopefully that will preview. And we should see the data come through in chronological order. So there we go. We see June, July, September, October for our personalization. Quick and easy to make that change as long as you know which of those fields change. Let's just go take another look at example, June and October. So there we go. That's how that all works there. So that's a quick overview of how to use lookup ordered rows and for loops. So let's just hop back into our deck and just see if there are any questions. Any questions so far I know that was a lot we covered there. Any questions from anybody on those 3 lookups and for loops in general?
That was an excellent session, Tim, really helpful. And while we check for any questions, I want to share a few things with everybody. So we would like you to explore these functions as we go through these sessions. As we progress through these sessions, it's very important that you understand all the functions that we have discussed in the previous sessions. So you can build on top of this and learn new functions as we go. So I'm putting here in the chat the reference guide. So you can go through this reference guide and find all the functions that we will be discussing. So today we have looked at all the utility functions and the data extension functions, which are very helpful. They're commonly used functions. In the next session, we are going to look at the date function, math function, text and content functions, if I'm not wrong. So as we discuss these in the session, after the session, I would strongly encourage everybody to go and do hands-on on your Marketing Cloud instance. Try to recreate these functions, try to come up with your own use case and use these functions and try to manipulate the data using the functions. And I would quickly share my screen, Tim, if you don't mind, if you're done with
Sure.
this presentation.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So Tim has showed here the references from the AMPScript guide. So AMPScript guide requires a purchase. So if you do not have a license already for the AMPScript guide, so you can purchase it if you have the budget. But if you are not planning for purchasing it, you can find this on the function reference as well. As I have inputted in the chat, the reference here, this is the reference document for all the functions. So Tim has demonstrated today all these utility functions and the data extension functions. So here you can click on this specific function name and you will be taken to the detailed syntax, the purpose of the function, the syntax, and how you can use this. So you can copy this code and use it in your dev org, the instance. And I have shared with you, if you do not have the Marketing Cloud instance, another way which you can try hands-on with the AMPScript, that is the MC snippets. So if anybody missed attending the session, please go back to the first session and see how to use the MC snippets. And I have also linked in the description how to use a detailed video on the MC snippets. You can go through that and use that as a way to explore these AMPScript functions. So this link as well, I have provided that in the chat. So highly recommend everyone, as we go through these sessions, please, you also try after the session, you try these functions out, and we would be happy to address any questions in the following session. So if today you explore these functions, you have any questions still, we can dedicate some time in the next session and we can discuss if you have any questions. And I'm looking at the chat to see if we have any questions, Tim. I'm not sure. I think Anthony already replied to this. Sandesh, as you're also checking the questions, please let me know if there are any questions which you haven't answered yet.
I can answer the question about the output twice for the concat functionality. It seems counterintuitive why you want to output you want to concat the variable itself. But if you let me just quickly show you in the content, we can take it out and you can see the difference. So if we took out this the output itself, right, it doesn't make sense, right? You're just trying to output this line, but what that variable is doing is just sort of adding the previous setting of the step output. So without that in place, it should just render the last row, the last step here. It won't render all 4 or 3 or 4 of them. So if we do a preview of this, yeah, it's just going to render just the one that you just did in your very last looping through all of the data. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but when you add that back in there, what it's basically doing is it's setting, say you have 4 loops through all this data, the step output's going to be the 3 different previous lines that you've created with this. And it's just going to keep adding it to it, especially if you have that bold return. So hopefully that answers that question. And then another person asked about the code snippet. So yeah, and this is this header code section. You typically want to put this in the top part of your email. You could put it at the very top, but we kind of like to have it a little bit below the header image, just so you can know where it is. And it just sets all of the coding for your entire email all the way through. You can't see it. You sort of just know where it is within each of your emails. And it just helps from an order of operation standpoint. If you set it at the top, it should work for all the blocks below, except for one section, which is the pre-header. The pre-header order of operations comes before this. So if you ever need to generate specific content, custom content within the pre-header, you have to do it either in the pre-header itself or at the very top of the HTML in your template.
Tim, there was also a question about personalizing CTA buttons, if you could address that.
Yeah, I mean, you can personalize, let's see, a question, how can we add this variable in CTA buttons instead of text? So yeah, if you want to add a CTA button, you can use custom, so let me just share my screen. We can import in, I think we do have a sample CTA button. So yeah, so in this get started, let's say we wanted to set a variable for CTA, and we'll just set it for now complete. Then we can just take this CTA variable and go into this variable. And instead of it being get started, we can use the v function and just output that variable. And then let's just see if that will review and test and render that. So really, personalization can be used anywhere in the email itself. And again, we just hard coded that example. You could have the CTA based on an if statement. The CTA could be brought through in your send date extension. Really, you can render information anywhere within the email itself. It's all open for that opportunity. I hope that was the question. Sandesh, do you think that was what they were asking for?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Tim?
Hopefully that was the answer.
Oh, yeah.
The question that they were looking for.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm seeing one more question, Sandesh. Why is the HTML code break or bold in quotes in the concat function?
Was it in bold? Tim, could we?
Yeah, it was in the build. I think it's in between the HTML code.
That's how you can add, when you're using either a concat function, you can add text or HTML in there, but in order to do that, you have to surround it by quotes. That's just the way that the function works. You can see the variable does not need quotes. If you're just rendering a variable, you can just use that. But if you're rendering text or HTML, you need to have each one of those sections surrounded by quotes in order for it to work.
Oh, I see the question. Yep, that is exactly right. So either it needs to be a variable or it needs to be in quotes.
We'll show you what happens if it's not in there. It should error out. It should be some sort of an if then an end if error. Yeah, it's giving an error that to resolve this script expression. So it's a labor of love adding in text and HTML in AMPScript. Really, it is an open canvas. You can render whatever you want in there, but be very careful and be very methodical on whenever you're building your concat statements, because you can build a concat statement that could be lines and lines and lines and lines of code. And if you just miss a single quote, it can error out and it's not going to really pinpoint exactly where that is. So it's great flexibility, great options in there, but be very mindful as you're building it to be careful to make sure you include those single quotes. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. And like JB said, we'll definitely answer any questions in our next session when Sandesh is going to be taking us through some more functionality.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Sandesh, for your help. And thanks, everybody, for joining today's session. I'll be uploading the recording as soon as possible. So please go through the session if you needed to review the code and if you want to copy the code and use it. So get your hands dirty, explore the functions, and any questions, let's discuss. We'll start the session a few minutes early, so we have time to discuss questions regarding the previous session. So we'll be looking forward to seeing you in the next session. That is Tuesday, same time. Thank you, everyone.